Albert Anastasia, a name whispered with fear in the dark corners of history, remains one of the most infamous and enigmatic figures of organized crime. His story, etched in blood and betrayal, is one of power, violence, and the cold efficiency of a man who could disappear into the shadows, only to resurface when someone had to be silenced. But there's something even more chilling about Anastasia's legacy. It's not just the countless murders that earned him his place among the deadliest figures in mafia lore, it's the unsettling mystery surrounding his own death. Murdered in plain sight, in the very seat of public life, yet the killers were never found, and the truth behind his demise remains a riddle to this day. Imagine a time, not long ago, when the streets of New York were ruled by shadows, and those who walked them had something darker behind their eyes. The 1930s and 40s were a time when the mafia wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was a force that shaped the very fabric of American society. And in the heart of this criminal underworld, Anastasia stood as a titan, leading Murder Incorporated, a group of hired killers responsible for the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, across the United States. It wasn't just about money or power for Albert, it was about a world where violence was the final word in any dispute. His name became synonymous with death, his reputation a guarantee of fear. But what makes his story even more fascinating is the contrast between the monster he was in the public eye and the man he was behind closed doors. To understand the depth of his story, you must first step back in time to the world from which he came. Born in Italy, in the small town of Tropea, Albert was the son of poor immigrants who hoped for a better life in the land of opportunity. But what awaited him was not freedom, but the cold, hard reality of living in the slums of Brooklyn. It was in the shadows of the city's industrial rise that Albert would come into contact with the underworld, a world that was violent, dangerous, and utterly ruthless. His life was a far cry from the dreams of riches and prosperity his parents had imagined. His first steps into this world were small, petty thefts, street fights, but it was there, in those grim back alleys, that his destiny would begin to unfold. By the time he was in his early 20s, Albert had already shed the skin of an innocent boy and was beginning to take on the persona of a mobster. He was not the first to join the mafia, nor the most ambitious, but he was, perhaps, the most relentless. His ambition was clear. He had no interest in living a life of mediocrity, he wanted to carve his name into the stone of history, and to do so, he would need power, and he would stop at nothing to get it. It wasn't long before he caught the attention of the most influential mob bosses of the time, including the notorious Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. These men would become his allies, but also, in some ways, his competitors. In a world where loyalty was as fleeting as the next paycheck, no one could be trusted completely. Yet Anastasia thrived in this world. His ruthlessness became his greatest asset. As the years went by, Anastasia's name became feared in the corridors of power. His rise to prominence within the ranks of the mafia was swift and brutal. He was not one to simply intimidate, he was a man who took what he wanted, and if anyone dared stand in his way, they would disappear, without a trace. His reputation as a cold-blooded killer grew. He didn't need to prove himself through words, his actions spoke louder than anything he could say. Whether it was overseeing executions for the mafia or orchestrating the brutal killings of his rivals, Anastasia was a man who understood the language of violence better than most understood the language of negotiation. It was in the early 1930s, during the height of the mafia's power in New York, that Anastasia would cement his place in history. He took control of Murder Incorporated, a group of hitmen who worked for the most powerful figures in organized crime. The organization itself was a well-oiled machine, designed for one thing and one thing only, to eliminate anyone deemed an obstacle. And Anastasia was the machine's master. Murder Incorporated was responsible for hundreds of killings, often in the most brutal and efficient ways possible. It was a world where life meant little, and death was as simple as pulling a trigger. Anastasia, with his cold demeanor and unflinching ability to carry out violence, became one of the most feared men in the country. But as the years passed, a darker side of Anastasia began to emerge. His loyalty, once unwavering to his bosses, began to waver as his ambition grew. It was a game of power, and Anastasia wanted more. He had no interest in merely being a foot soldier in the underworld, he wanted to sit at the head of the table. And so, the power struggles began. He wasn't content with simply following orders, he sought to command, to control, and to reshape the very structure of the mafia itself. His drive for power led him to clash with some of the most dangerous men in the world. His reputation grew, but so did his enemies. In the midst of his rise to power, Anastasia's world began to unravel. His paranoia grew, fed by the constant threat of betrayal and the fear of losing everything he had built. The very men who had once been his allies now became threats in his eyes. No one, not even his closest associates, were safe from his suspicion. He knew that in the mafia, there were no guarantees. Loyalty was always a commodity, and betrayal was a given. Every move he made was calculated, every word spoken was carefully weighed. But even the most calculating men can make missteps, and Anastasia's paranoia would ultimately cost him dearly. It was during this time, in the late 1940s, that Anastasia would meet his end, not in a dark alley or a smoky back room, but in a barbershop. His assassination, carried out by men who were never identified, was as chilling as it was mysterious. Shot dead in a public space, Anastasia's murder sent shockwaves through the mafia and the public alike. It was a death that no one could have predicted, and to this day, the identity of his killers remains a mystery. The mafia, it seemed, had turned on one of its own, and the man who had once ruled the shadows of New York was gone, his empire crumbling around him. The question that remains, however, is why? Why was Albert Anastasia killed? Was it a power struggle? A betrayal? Or was it something more? His death, shrouded in mystery, continues to haunt the annals of mafia history. Was Anastasia a victim of his own ambition, or was he the victim of a game far more complex than anyone could have imagined? What remains is a legacy of death, mystery, and power, a man who lived and died in the shadows, his name forever etched in the dark history of the mafia. Albert Anastasia's journey from the small, sun-baked streets of Tropea, Italy, to the dark and dangerous underbelly of New York City is a story of transformation. Born into a world where poverty and struggle were constant companions, Anastasia's early life was shaped by hardship. As the youngest of a large family, his childhood was marked by the constant struggle to survive, a struggle that would later define his rise in the brutal world of organized crime. His family, like many others, dreamed of a better life in America, a land where they could escape the crushing poverty that defined their lives in Sicily. But what awaited them in the new world was far from the paradise they had envisioned. In reality, the streets of New York were every bit as unforgiving, and the promise of opportunity was often overshadowed by the harsh realities of life for immigrants. The journey across the Atlantic was arduous, but it was nothing compared to the challenges that awaited them in the Lower East Side of New York. The family settled in one of the city's toughest neighborhoods, where crime, poverty, and corruption were part of the fabric of everyday life. It was a world where the powerful preyed on the weak, and where survival often meant choosing sides in a war that wasn't fought with weapons, but with influence and fear. It was in this harsh environment that Albert began to mature, shaped by the violence that often erupted on the streets and the constant struggle for survival. The grim reality of life in the immigrant slums became his foundation, a foundation built on the raw determination to escape it. At an early age, Albert realized that the traditional paths to success, education, hard work, and perseverance, were not going to offer him the escape he craved. The world around him was run by criminals, men who had carved out their own paths to wealth and power, and to Albert, they seemed to have it all. They had control, respect, and the kind of power that ordinary men could only dream of. So, as many before him had done, he chose to join their ranks. The allure of easy money, power, and the freedom to make his own rules was irresistible. He began his journey into the criminal world, not with grand plans of becoming a kingpin, but with a simple desire to rise above the grime of his surroundings. At first, his crimes were small, a petty theft here, a street brawl there, but each was a step towards something bigger. In the rough neighborhoods of Brooklyn, Albert learned the rules of the street, watching as men like him rose and fell. The lessons were brutal and unforgiving, but they were the only lessons that mattered in a world where strength and ruthlessness determined one's place. It wasn't long before Albert, with his steely gaze and his cold determination, caught the attention of the right people. He became known to the influential figures who controlled the criminal rackets in the city. These men saw something in him, a drive, an ambition, and a ruthlessness that they admired. Soon, he was no longer a small-time criminal, but a trusted lieutenant in the ever-growing network of organized crime. As Albert became more entrenched in the world of mafia, he began to carve out a reputation of his own. He wasn't just another thug, he was someone who understood how power worked. He understood that in this world, loyalty was everything, but so was the ability to strike fear into the hearts of others. His rise was not an accident. He had learned quickly that in the mafia, there was no room for hesitation, no space for weakness. If you wanted to survive, you had to strike hard, fast, and without mercy. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to dominate. And dominate he did. Through his connection with powerful mob bosses like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, Anastasia found himself rising through the ranks. These were men who saw the value in his cold, calculating nature. Luciano, in particular, took an interest in him, recognizing in Albert a potential that could be harnessed for the greater good of the mafia. Together, they began to shape the criminal landscape of New York. But as Albert's power grew, so too did his ambition. He no longer saw himself as a mere enforcer or soldier in the criminal world. He wanted more. Much more. It was during this time that Albert's most infamous creation, Murder Incorporated, began to take shape. He understood that power in the mafia was not just about controlling territory or making money. It was about control over life and death itself. And Murder Incorporated was the key to that control. It was a group of killers for hire, a network of men who could eliminate anyone, anywhere, without question or hesitation. The killers of Murder Incorporated didn't just kill, they did it with cold efficiency. It was business to them, nothing personal. And Albert was the man who ran it all. He was the one who made the decisions, who gave the orders. He was the one who decided who lived and who died. Under Albert's leadership, Murder Incorporated became the most feared assassination squad in the country. They were the muscle behind the mafia's rise to power, and Anastasia was the one who ensured that anyone who crossed the mafia paid the ultimate price. But Anastasia's role as the head of Murder Incorporated also marked a turning point in his life. As his power grew, so did his paranoia. The very men who had helped him rise to power were now potential threats, rivals who sought to undermine his control. He had made enemies, and those enemies were closing in. But Anastasia was no fool. He knew that power in the mafia was fleeting, and he understood that loyalty was never guaranteed. He had seen too many men fall because they trusted the wrong people. So, he made sure to surround himself with men who could be counted on, men who were as ruthless as he was. But even with this network of loyal followers, Anastasia knew that his position was never secure. In the mafia, the higher you climbed, the further you had to fall. The tension in his life was palpable. The constant fear of betrayal gnawed at him, even as he built his empire. He trusted no one completely, not even his closest allies. And yet, his ambitions only grew. He dreamed of more power, more respect, more control. The underworld was his playground, and he was determined to make it his kingdom. But as Anastasia's empire grew, so did the enemies that sought to bring him down. The power struggles within the mafia, the backstabbing and manipulation, began to take their toll on him. The fear of betrayal became his constant companion. But no matter how many times he was betrayed, no matter how many enemies tried to bring him down, Anastasia was a man who would not be denied. His rise to power was as much a result of his cunning as it was of his ability to survive in a world that demanded blood for blood. In a way, he was the perfect product of the mafia system, ruthless, ambitious, and willing to do whatever it took to stay on top. By the time the 1940s rolled around, Anastasia had become a major player in the mafia, his name synonymous with fear. He had achieved what many in the criminal world only dreamed of. He had power, respect, and wealth beyond his wildest imagination. But as he reached the peak of his power, the shadows that had once been his allies began to turn against him. He was no longer just a criminal, he was a target. His rise was as inevitable as his fall. Albert Anastasia's story is one of rise and fall, of power and paranoia, and ultimately, of a man who was undone by the very ambition that had driven him to the top. It is a tale of a man who sought to carve his name into the annals of history but found that the price of power is often death. As Anastasia's empire crumbled, so too did the world he had built, a world of shadows, murder, and betrayal. Albert Anastasia's transformation from a young immigrant in the slums of New York to one of the most feared and powerful figures in the world of organized crime was not just a result of ambition, but of a ruthless understanding of the world around him. As a young man, he had seen it all, the poverty, the violence, and the constant struggle for survival. But the one thing that stood out in the world he was raised in was the unspoken truth that power, control, and respect could only be earned through fear and force. It wasn't enough to simply survive in this world, one had to dominate it. This belief would shape not only his rise in the criminal world but also the very nature of his character. By the time Albert had found his way into the mafia's ranks, he had already learned some of the harshest lessons life could teach. The brutality of the streets had hardened him, but it also gave him an invaluable education in the unspoken laws of the underworld. Loyalty was a currency more valuable than money, but so was ruthlessness. And Albert, as a young man, quickly realized that to earn loyalty, one had to command fear. It wasn't long before he was noticed by some of the most influential figures in the mafia world. His cold eyes and calculating demeanor made him stand out from the other young men who aspired to the same criminal lifestyle. They could see something in him, something that made him a valuable asset. His first break came when he was introduced to the powerful Castellamarese clan. The clan, which controlled much of the crime in New York at the time, was embroiled in a violent power struggle with rival factions. It was in the heat of this war that Albert would make his mark. As a young man, he proved himself to be both an efficient and utterly merciless enforcer. He was a man who got things done, no questions asked, and no hesitation in carrying out orders. Whether it was collecting debts, intimidating rivals, or taking out enemies of the clan, Albert became the go-to man for the dirty work. His actions were swift and brutal, and soon, his reputation began to spread beyond the tight circles of the mafia. It wasn't long before Albert found himself in the inner circle of New York's most powerful mafia figures. Lucky Luciano, the charismatic and ambitious mob boss, saw the potential in Albert. Luciano's rise had been swift and calculated, and he recognized that Anastasia had the same cold ambition that he himself had relied upon to secure power. Anastasia was soon brought into the fold, not as a mere foot soldier, but as a trusted lieutenant. Luciano and his right-hand men, including Meyer Lansky, would groom Albert for a much larger role, one that would elevate him to the pinnacle of the mafia's most dangerous players. But Albert was not content with simply being a lieutenant. His ambition was far greater than that. He had learned from the best, and he knew that power in the mafia wasn't just about making money or gaining influence, it was about control over life and death. That's when the idea for Murder Incorporated began to take shape. Murder Incorporated was not just a group of hired killers, it was an organization built on cold, efficient murder for hire. Anastasia understood that in the criminal underworld, there was no greater tool for power than the ability to kill on command. Murder Incorporated would become his most powerful weapon. With the creation of Murder Incorporated, Albert Anastasia took on a role that would make him both feared and infamous. He was the mastermind behind the organization, a network of killers that could eliminate anyone, anywhere, for the right price. The men who made up Murder Incorporated were not ordinary criminals, they were highly skilled professionals, trained to carry out assassinations with lethal precision. But Anastasia's genius lay in his ability to organize and direct this network, turning a chaotic collection of killers into a well-oiled machine. Whether it was for a business rival, a traitor, or an enemy of the mafia, Murder Incorporated was there to make sure that no one stood in the way of the mob's interests. The rise of Murder Incorporated also marked a turning point in Albert's character. As his influence grew, so too did his thirst for power. It was not enough for him to merely oversee killings and enforce loyalty, he wanted more. He began to see himself not just as an enforcer but as a kingmaker. The mafia world, which had once seemed so vast and unconquerable, now appeared to be his to control. But with this new sense of power came an even greater burden, the fear of betrayal. In the cutthroat world of organized crime, betrayal was always lurking around the corner. Loyalty could only be relied upon for as long as it served those who held the power. And Albert Anastasia, as he climbed to the top, began to realize that his closest allies could also be his greatest threats. The men he had worked alongside, trusted, and helped rise through the ranks now looked at him with the same calculating eyes that he had once used to evaluate others. No one was safe, not even the men who had helped him build his empire. As Anastasia's power grew, so did the enemies who sought to tear him down. Rival mob bosses, once his allies, began to see him as a threat to their own authority. In the mafia world, there was always a power struggle, an unspoken war for dominance, and Anastasia was squarely in the center of it. He had made enemies, not just among outsiders, but within his own ranks. The men he had helped rise to power were now beginning to question his authority. It was this paranoia, this constant fear of betrayal, that would come to define the final years of his life. But Anastasia was not one to back down. Even as his enemies closed in on him, he continued to assert his dominance. He knew that in the mafia, showing any sign of weakness was the surest way to lose everything. And so, he carried on, ruthlessly eliminating those who posed a threat to his empire, even if they were once his closest allies. His fear of betrayal led him to trust fewer and fewer people, but it also made him more dangerous. He became a man who could not be stopped, not because he was invincible, but because he had learned the one lesson that every great mobster knew: to survive in the mafia, you had to be willing to destroy anyone who stood in your way. As the power struggles and paranoia began to take their toll, Albert Anastasia's grip on the mafia world became increasingly unstable. His name, once a symbol of fear and respect, began to be whispered with a sense of dread not just because of the violence he had inflicted, but because of the instability he had created. His actions, driven by his insatiable thirst for power, had made him a marked man. The very empire he had built through bloodshed was now beginning to crumble under the weight of his own ambitions. And yet, despite the growing instability, Anastasia remained steadfast in his belief that he was untouchable. His past victories, his dominance over Murder Incorporated, and his ability to navigate the complex world of mafia politics made him believe that no one could ever truly bring him down. He had built an empire based on fear, and he thought that fear would protect him from the enemies closing in on him. But as he would soon learn, power in the mafia was as fragile as it was fleeting. No one, not even Albert Anastasia, could remain on top forever. The rise of Murder Incorporated was the pinnacle of Albert Anastasia's career, a brutal yet brilliant creation that would cement his reputation as one of the most feared figures in the mafia. To understand the power and significance of Murder Incorporated, it's important to realize that it wasn't just a gang of hitmen. It was an organized network of professional killers who operated under the direct orders of the mafia's highest echelons. And Albert was the man who orchestrated it all. He was not just a leader in name, but a mastermind who understood the value of precision, loyalty, and fear in maintaining control. Murder Incorporated was born from the chaos of the mafia's internal struggles for dominance, a time when the only way to settle disputes was through violence. As the criminal empire grew, so did the necessity for a tool that could eliminate rivals, traitors, and anyone who dared to stand in the way of the mob's goals. Albert Anastasia saw an opportunity to create an elite team of assassins, men who could kill without hesitation, without emotion, and with military precision. These weren't just hired guns, they were professionals who understood the gravity of their work. Murder was a business, and in business, there was no room for mistakes. In the years leading up to the formation of Murder Incorporated, Anastasia had already demonstrated his cold, methodical approach to violence. He was known for being a man who could strike without warning, whose methods were swift and efficient. He had proven time and again that he was willing to go to any lengths to protect his interests and the interests of his superiors. But as the power struggles within the mafia escalated, Anastasia realized that he needed something more, a way to make sure that no one could ever challenge his position, a way to ensure that his empire would remain untouchable. That's when he decided to build Murder Incorporated. The structure of Murder Incorporated was as ruthlessly efficient as its leader. It was made up of a small group of killers who were carefully selected for their skills, loyalty, and ability to execute orders without question. The men who became part of this group were not ordinary criminals. They were trained to be killers, each one a cog in a much larger machine. The most important thing was that they were entirely loyal to Anastasia and the mafia bosses who controlled the city. Loyalty, in the world of Murder Incorporated, was more than just a word, it was a matter of survival. The organization operated with a strict code of silence, and any member who betrayed that code would face a swift and brutal punishment. As Murder Incorporated grew in power, it became an essential tool for the mafia. Anastasia's network of killers was called upon whenever there was a need to eliminate a problem. Whether it was a rival gang member, a disloyal associate, or even an innocent bystander who got in the way, Murder Incorporated had the means to carry out the job with ruthless efficiency. They didn't just kill, they did it with precision and purpose. Each murder was carefully planned, executed without emotion, and then erased from memory. The killers of Murder Incorporated were invisible ghosts, their victims falling without a trace. The power of Murder Incorporated didn't just lie in its ability to kill, it was also a tool of intimidation. The mere knowledge that such an organization existed was enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone who knew how the mafia operated. It was a constant reminder that in the world of organized crime, the line between life and death was razor-thin. Anastasia knew that in this world, control wasn't just about money or territory, it was about instilling fear. And nothing created fear quite like the unseen hand of Murder Incorporated. One day, you could be sitting at your dinner table, and the next, you could be dead without knowing why. Despite the cold efficiency of Murder Incorporated, it wasn't without its dangers. Anastasia had to constantly balance the need for loyalty and the necessity of ensuring his killers remained in line. The mafia, after all, was a world built on betrayal, and Anastasia was well aware that the very men who killed for him could just as easily turn on him if the right offer came along. He had to ensure that his organization stayed tightly controlled, that no one stepped out of line. Paranoia, for Anastasia, was an ever-present companion. He trusted few, but he kept his enemies closer. The methods of Murder Incorporated were as brutal as they were effective. The killers worked under strict orders, each mission designed with the efficiency of a military operation. The hits themselves were often carried out in broad daylight, in plain sight, and with little regard for the chaos they caused. For Anastasia and his men, there was no such thing as a clean murder. Every assassination was messy, violent, and left its mark on the city. But that was the point, terror was a weapon, and it was a weapon that worked. The mafia thrived on fear, and Murder Incorporated was the enforcer of that fear. It was a tool of destruction, and Anastasia used it to his advantage every chance he got. But as Murder Incorporated expanded, so too did the complications. With each hit, Anastasia was walking a finer line. The higher the body count, the more attention the mafia drew, and the more dangerous the game became. In the world of organized crime, there was always a price to pay, and that price was becoming steeper by the day. The more people Murder Incorporated killed, the more the mafia's enemies began to close in. Law enforcement, once slow and uninterested in mafia affairs, was now paying attention. The public's awareness of the mafia's activities was growing, and with it, the risks associated with Anastasia's operations. Despite these mounting risks, Anastasia continued to operate Murder Incorporated with cold efficiency. He was a man who didn't flinch, who didn't hesitate, and who was willing to do whatever it took to protect his interests. His ambition grew as his power did, and Murder Incorporated became his weapon to secure his place at the top of the mafia world. But as with all great empires, the seeds of destruction were already being sown. Anastasia had created something powerful, but he had also created something that was too powerful for its own good. Murder Incorporated was a tool of destruction, but in the end, it would be the very thing that would unravel his empire. As the 1940s wore on, the tensions within the mafia reached a boiling point. The criminal world, once a tight-knit group of loyal associates, had begun to splinter. Rival factions, each with their own agendas, were vying for control. And Anastasia, despite his power and ruthlessness, was not immune to the forces that were tearing apart the very organization he had helped build. His control over Murder Incorporated began to slip as his enemies grew more determined and more daring. The very thing that had made him invincible, the ability to destroy anyone who crossed him, was now becoming his greatest weakness. But even as his world began to fall apart, Anastasia remained a force to be reckoned with. His ambition, his coldness, and his ability to wield power through fear ensured that his name would live on in the annals of mafia history. Murder Incorporated may have been destroyed by the very men who had once served it, but the legacy of Albert Anastasia would remain. In the world of organized crime, the line between life and death is never clear, and Anastasia's story would prove that in the end, the very powers that created him would be the same forces that destroyed him. As the 1940s progressed, Albert Anastasia's grip on the underworld seemed unshakable. He had built an empire founded on fear, loyalty, and ruthlessness, but the cracks in that empire were beginning to show. The very men who had once revered him were now questioning his leadership. In the world of organized crime, loyalty was fleeting, and betrayal was always lurking in the shadows. Anastasia had made enemies, not just in the streets, but among his closest allies. The mafia, for all its power, was a volatile entity, constantly shifting, with alliances as fragile as glass. And Albert, once the king of this shadowy realm, now found himself surrounded by whispers of dissent, whispers that threatened to tear down everything he had worked so hard to build. The nature of mafia politics is as brutal as it is complicated. What had once been a tightly knit, formidable alliance of mobsters now began to fracture. As the war for dominance continued to simmer beneath the surface, the mafia's traditional structure began to show signs of strain. The men who once stood side by side with Albert, men like Meyer Lansky and the infamous Lucky Luciano, had their own ambitions, their own plans for the future. Anastasia had always been a man of action, someone who rose to power through sheer force, but as the years wore on, it became apparent that his old ways were becoming increasingly dangerous. The more powerful he became, the more enemies he made. And this would be his downfall. By now, Anastasia was no longer just a figurehead of Murder Incorporated. He had grown into something larger than life, an iconic symbol of mafia power and violence. But with this larger-than-life persona came immense pressure. His enemies weren't just from outside the organization anymore, they were men who had once fought alongside him, men who had risen to power through his help. The very men who had built the mafia alongside him were now plotting against him, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a moment of reckoning that Albert could not escape. His paranoia, once a tool of survival, now became a weakness. He began to distrust even those who had shown him loyalty in the past, seeing betrayal where there was none, and in doing so, alienated those who could have been his allies in the coming storm. One of the key turning points in Anastasia's downfall came when his relationship with his former allies, especially those in the Luciano Lansky faction, began to sour. Luciano, once a mentor to Anastasia, had built the framework of the mafia empire that spanned the United States, but as time passed, even he began to see Albert as a liability. Lucky Luciano, a man known for his strategic mind and ability to adapt to changing circumstances, had learned that the mafia, like any empire, could not be built on pure fear alone. There had to be trust, collaboration, and a careful balance between power and respect. Anastasia, with his increasingly erratic behavior and relentless ambition, no longer fit that model. It wasn't just Luciano who began to distance himself from Anastasia, Meyer Lansky, another key figure in the mafia, also grew wary of his growing influence and unpredictable nature. Lansky, the so-called mob's accountant, was a man who understood the importance of stability and strategy. Unlike Anastasia, who saw violence as the only solution to a problem, Lansky believed in a more subtle form of power. Lansky, with his genius for financial schemes and his keen ability to manipulate the levers of organized crime without drawing attention, saw Anastasia's ruthlessness as a threat to the delicate balance of their operation. Lansky's growing distrust of Albert would ultimately play a role in his downfall. The cracks in Anastasia's empire, fueled by his paranoia and the growing tensions between him and his former allies, were now undeniable. By the time Anastasia began to realize that the tides were turning against him, it was already too late. The men who had once stood by his side were now quietly plotting to unseat him. The shifting allegiances, the whispers behind closed doors, all pointed toward one inevitable conclusion: Albert Anastasia's reign was coming to an end. But Anastasia, ever the survivor, had not yet fully grasped the severity of the situation. In the world of the mafia, trust was a rare commodity, and Anastasia had learned it the hard way. His ambition and his desire for absolute power had alienated those who had once helped him climb to the top. The power struggles within the mafia were not just about money or territory, they were about control of the very soul of the organization. Anastasia's increasingly violent tendencies, paired with his growing isolation from the other mafia families, had made him a liability. The men who had once feared him now saw him as a threat, a man who could no longer be controlled. And in the cutthroat world of organized crime, anyone who was seen as a threat was quickly eliminated. As the whispers of betrayal became louder, Albert Anastasia found himself retreating further into his own paranoia. He had always been a man of action, someone who trusted only his instincts and his ability to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. But now, he was surrounded by enemies, both real and imagined. His mind, once sharp and calculating, was clouded by the fear that the very empire he had built was beginning to slip through his fingers. But instead of confronting his fears head-on, Anastasia began to make mistakes, small mistakes at first, but ones that would eventually prove to be his undoing. His reliance on violence, once his greatest strength, had become his greatest weakness. He had failed to adapt to the changing dynamics of the mafia, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. The situation reached a boiling point in 1957, when Anastasia's grip on the mob had become increasingly tenuous. His enemies were closing in from all sides, and the final blow came when he was lured into a trap in the most unexpected of places. Albert Anastasia, the man who had once been untouchable, was killed in cold blood in the very seat of power that he had created for himself. It wasn't in a dark alley or a backroom, it was in the barber's chair, a place that should have been a sanctuary for a man of his stature. On October 25, 1957, Anastasia was shot multiple times by two unknown assailants while sitting in his barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel. The murder, carried out in broad daylight, shocked the mafia world and sent ripples through the criminal underworld. No one had expected it, and no one had seen it coming. The man who had been at the heart of the mafia's most feared and powerful operation had been eliminated in a moment of utter vulnerability. The murder of Albert Anastasia marked the end of an era in the mafia's history, a brutal conclusion to the rise of one of the most infamous figures in organized crime. And yet, the identity of his killers remains a mystery to this day. Some believe it was a power struggle within the mafia, with rivals seeking to eliminate him as a threat. Others speculate that his death was the result of a plot by those he had once considered his allies. The truth behind his assassination remains shrouded in mystery, adding another layer to the legend of Albert Anastasia. In the wake of his death, the mafia was left to pick up the pieces of a fractured empire. Anastasia's legacy, though marked by bloodshed and violence, is also a testament to the brutal realities of power. His life and death serve as a reminder that in the world of organized crime, no one is ever truly safe. Even the most powerful men, the ones who control life and death, can be brought down in an instant. Albert Anastasia's story is one of rise and fall, of ambition, paranoia, and betrayal. It is a story that continues to fascinate and haunt the world, a story that proves that in the end, the price of power is often death itself. Albert Anastasia's death in 1957 marked not only the end of his life but the fall of an era in organized crime. The murder of such a powerful and feared figure sent shockwaves through the underworld. Yet, the legacy of Anastasia lived on, casting a long shadow over the mafia for years to come. His story, full of ambition, violence, betrayal, and a relentless pursuit of power, would continue to serve as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of the brutal realities of the criminal empire he helped build. But even in death, Albert Anastasia remained a figure of fascination, his life leaving behind questions that still linger today. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the mafia was thrown into chaos. The organization that had once been unified under strong leaders like Luciano and Lansky was now splintered. Power struggles erupted, as factions within the mafia fought for control of the territories Anastasia had ruled. Anastasia's death didn't just mark the loss of a leader, it created a vacuum, one that many were eager to fill. But in the unpredictable and often violent world of organized crime, taking the throne wasn't as simple as filling an empty seat. It required much more than just power and ruthlessness, it required the ability to navigate the treacherous waters of mafia politics. And in the years that followed Anastasia's death, those who sought to take his place were forced to confront the ghosts of his legacy. One of the first challenges faced by those left behind after Anastasia's assassination was how to maintain control over Murder Incorporated, the killing machine that had once served as Anastasia's greatest weapon. Murder Incorporated was a symbol of his power, an organization of cold-blooded killers who did his bidding without question. But with Anastasia's death, the organization began to unravel. The network of hitmen that had once been so tightly controlled now found themselves without a clear leader, and in the vacuum left behind, rival factions began to vie for control. The fear and loyalty that had bound Murder Incorporated together began to dissipate, and with it went the ability to carry out the cold, efficient assassinations that had made Anastasia such a feared figure in the mafia. The dissolution of Murder Incorporated was just the beginning of a much larger transformation within the mafia itself. Anastasia had been a man who thrived on violence and intimidation. His rise to power was marked by a series of bloody confrontations and power struggles, and his death was no exception. As the rival factions within the mafia tried to consolidate their power, they found themselves facing a new reality. The violent tactics that had once worked so effectively were now becoming a liability. The public was becoming more aware of the mafia's activities, and law enforcement was beginning to catch up. The days of operating in the shadows were coming to an end, and the mafia would have to adapt to a changing world if it wanted to survive. But the changes that followed Anastasia's death were not just about survival, they were about a redefinition of power. The men who sought to rise in the wake of his assassination had learned valuable lessons from his downfall. They understood that in the world of organized crime, it wasn't enough to be ruthless. It was no longer just about killing for power or wealth. In the post-Anastasia world, survival depended on the ability to adapt, to think strategically, and to work within a larger network of alliances. The mafia, though still a world built on fear, was becoming a more complex, multifaceted organization. This new reality was evident in the way the mafia's leadership began to shift. The mafia's old guard, men like Luciano and Lansky, had always understood the importance of working with others, of building alliances and navigating the complex web of power dynamics that existed within the criminal world. But Anastasia had been different. He had been a man who operated largely on instinct and power, a man who was driven by his own personal ambitions rather than the collective goals of the mafia. In the aftermath of his death, the mafia found itself looking for new leadership, men who could balance power with diplomacy, violence with subtlety. One such figure was Carlo Gambino, a man who had worked his way up through the ranks of the mafia and who would eventually rise to prominence as one of the most powerful mob bosses in America. Gambino, unlike Anastasia, was a man of patience and cunning. He understood that in the world of organized crime, it wasn't just about taking power, it was about keeping it. Gambino's rise to power was marked by his ability to make alliances, both within the mafia and with outsiders. He was a man who knew how to navigate the shifting tides of mafia politics, and he would ultimately become the new face of the mafia after Anastasia's death. Gambino's leadership marked a new chapter in the history of the mafia. Under his guidance, the mafia began to evolve, moving away from the violent, all-out battles for power that had defined Anastasia's era. Gambino recognized that in order to survive in the changing landscape of post-war America, the mafia had to adapt. The days of brutal killings and overt power struggles were coming to an end. Instead, the mafia would focus on more subtle forms of control, using its influence to manipulate politicians, businesses, and law enforcement. It would no longer be a world of overt violence and bloodshed, but one where power was wielded through cleverness, strategy, and manipulation. Yet, despite Gambino's success in steering the mafia toward a more sophisticated approach, the memory of Anastasia and his reign of terror lingered. The fear and respect that Anastasia had commanded still haunted the underworld. He had been a figure who embodied the mafia's most brutal traditions, and his death had left a hole in the psyche of the mafia's leadership. There was a sense that, even as the mafia evolved, it would never truly shake the legacy of men like Anastasia. His shadow continued to hang over the organization, a reminder of what it had once been, and what it could still become. In the years after Anastasia's death, his name would continue to be whispered in mafia circles, a symbol of power and terror. His reputation as the ruthless head of Murder Incorporated would only grow with time, as the mafia tried to distance itself from the violence and bloodshed of its past. But for all the efforts to reshape the mafia, the essence of Anastasia's legacy remained. He had been a man who had understood the importance of fear, and in the end, it was fear that had brought him down. His death had come swiftly, without warning, and it had come at the hands of those who once feared him the most. But even in death, Albert Anastasia's legacy continued to shape the mafia in ways that no one could have predicted. The story of Albert Anastasia is one of rise and fall, of ambition and betrayal, but it is also a story of survival. The mafia, like any empire, was built on the backs of men like Anastasia, men who were willing to do whatever it took to rise to the top. And though his death marked the end of an era, it was also the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the mafia. The mafia would never forget the lessons that Anastasia had taught them, the lessons of power, loyalty, and fear. And though his name would eventually fade from the headlines, the impact of his life and death would never be fully erased from the annals of criminal history. The murder of Albert Anastasia, while a shocking and brutal act, was not just the end of a man, it was the beginning of a new chapter in the ever-evolving history of the mafia. His death would leave a void in the criminal underworld that many would attempt to fill, but none would ever truly be able to replicate the terror and control he had once wielded. What happened next in the aftermath of Anastasia's murder is a testament to the delicate balance of power in the world of organized crime and the consequences of upheaval in an empire built on fear and loyalty. In the immediate wake of Anastasia's assassination, the mafia found itself in a state of turmoil. The streets were filled with whispers of who could have been behind the hit, and speculations ran rampant. While the official story was that Anastasia's murder was orchestrated by rival factions seeking to eliminate him as a threat, the truth was more complex. The mafia, like any empire, was a web of interconnected relationships, alliances, and betrayals, and the death of one key figure often set off a chain reaction of events that affected not just the immediate players involved, but the entire organization. Anastasia had made plenty of enemies during his rise to power, and those enemies were now circling, waiting for their opportunity. One of the immediate consequences of Anastasia's death was the destabilization of Murder Incorporated, the feared assassination squad that he had established. Murder Incorporated had operated as a highly efficient and organized group, but without Anastasia's firm hand at the helm, it began to disintegrate. The killers who had once worked under his command now found themselves without a clear leader, and the group's cohesion quickly faltered. For the first time in years, the mafia's enemies saw an opportunity to strike back, and the once impenetrable network of assassins was no longer a weapon that could be wielded with the same effectiveness. The death of Anastasia had weakened not just his direct influence, but the entire structure that had supported his power. Despite the unraveling of Murder Incorporated, the mafia still needed to establish new leadership in the wake of Anastasia's death. The vacuum left behind was significant, and various factions within the organization began to jockey for power. The mafia's old guard, including men like Luciano and Lansky, saw the shifting tides as an opportunity to reassert their dominance. But the world had changed. The public was more aware of the mafia's existence, and law enforcement was beginning to get more aggressive in their pursuit of criminal organizations. The days of unchecked violence were coming to an end, and the mafia needed a new approach to maintain its grip on power. One of the men who would eventually rise to fill the void left by Anastasia was Carlo Gambino. Gambino was a quiet, unassuming man who had spent years working his way through the ranks of the mafia, always biding his time. Unlike Anastasia, who had built his power through sheer violence, Gambino understood the importance of patience, strategy, and subtlety. His approach to mafia politics was more cerebral. He knew that to maintain power in the changing world of organized crime, he would need to adapt. Gambino's rise was not marked by bloodshed and brutality, but by careful negotiation and a deep understanding of the shifting dynamics of power within the mafia. He was a man who knew how to make allies, how to read the political landscape, and how to wait for the right moment to strike. Gambino's ascension to power was not without its challenges. The other mafia bosses who had been rivals to Anastasia were now rivals to him. The power struggle within the mafia intensified, and each faction tried to gain the upper hand. But Gambino's strategy was simple. He kept a low profile, avoided making enemies unnecessarily, and built relationships with key players in the organization. He understood that the mafia, at its core, was about control, but it was also about building a network of trust. Gambino's ability to broker peace between rival factions allowed him to gain influence and gradually consolidate power. In the years following Anastasia's death, Gambino would become one of the most powerful men in the mafia, steering the organization into a new era of influence and wealth. Yet, despite the shifting dynamics and the rise of new leadership, the ghost of Albert Anastasia loomed large over the mafia. His brutal reign, his empire of fear, and his willingness to eliminate anyone who stood in his way had set a precedent that many of the new leaders could not forget. Gambino, for all his tact and subtlety, could never fully erase the memory of the man who had ruled with an iron fist. In some ways, Anastasia's legacy was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it had shown the mafia the power of ruthlessness and absolute control. On the other hand, it had proven that such a strategy was ultimately unsustainable. The violence, the betrayals, and the constant fear that had defined Anastasia's reign were not the foundation upon which the mafia could build a stable future. Gambino's success in the aftermath of Anastasia's death can also be attributed to his ability to adapt to the changing landscape of organized crime. In the early days of the mafia, power had been consolidated through violence, intimidation, and the control of illicit businesses. But as the world evolved, so too did the methods used by criminals to maintain their dominance. By the 1960s, the mafia was becoming more involved in legitimate businesses and financial dealings. It was no longer enough to simply control the docks or the gambling halls. The true power now lay in the ability to manipulate industries, control unions, and infiltrate the legitimate economy. Gambino understood this, and as he rose to power, he began to steer the mafia toward a more sophisticated model of operation. His leadership would mark the beginning of a new era for the mafia, one that was more subtle, more strategic, and, in many ways, more dangerous. But even as Gambino was consolidating his power, the memory of Anastasia's violent reign continued to shape the culture of the mafia. The lessons learned from his rise and fall were still fresh in the minds of the men who had been part of his empire. The fear that he had instilled in the hearts of his enemies was still palpable, even as the mafia moved in a new direction. Anastasia's name became synonymous with the old ways of the mafia, ways that were marked by bloodshed, ruthlessness, and a singular focus on power. As the mafia moved forward, they were constantly looking over their shoulders, wondering if the same fate that had befallen Anastasia would one day come for them. The death of Albert Anastasia did not just mark the end of his life, it marked the end of an era in organized crime. His legacy, though clouded by violence and fear, left an indelible mark on the mafia world. In the years that followed, the mafia would evolve, adapting to new challenges and new threats. But the lessons learned from Anastasia's reign, lessons about power, control, and the price of betrayal, would continue to resonate in the world of organized crime for decades to come. As the mafia adapted and changed, they would never forget the man who had once ruled them all with an iron fist. His death was the end of one chapter, but it was also the beginning of another, and his legacy would continue to shape the course of organized crime for years to come. Albert Anastasia's legacy, marked by his unparalleled ruthlessness and strategic vision, continued to cast a long shadow over the world of organized crime long after his death. Despite his violent and volatile reign, the mafia world could not easily move on from the man who had shaped so much of its character and operations. His rise from a humble beginning to the feared Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated was a story that would be whispered for years to come. The void left by his death was not only a matter of leadership but also of fear and control, a fear that had driven his actions and defined his very existence. In the wake of his assassination, the ripple effects would be felt far beyond the immediate turmoil of the mafia's power struggle. As the mafia adapted and reorganized itself under new leadership, the old guard still maintained a firm grip on the underworld. Men like Carlo Gambino and his associates sought to re-establish order, but the memory of Anastasia's iron-fisted rule lingered. The mafia, a world built on secrecy and violence, had always been one of loyalty, but loyalty was now more fragile than ever. The fractured nature of the criminal organization after Anastasia's death revealed just how much of the mafia had been held together by his brutal authority and intimidation. His presence, once a stabilizing force, had now become a reminder of the price of unchecked ambition. Despite his brutal and often chaotic reign, Anastasia had, in many ways, been a necessary figure for the mafia. Under his watch, the organization had grown both more powerful and more ruthless. It was during this time that the mafia's grip over various criminal enterprises across the country reached its peak, stretching from the lucrative gambling rackets in New York City to the drug trade and labor unions in the broader United States. Murder Incorporated was not just an instrument of assassination, it was the mafia's enforcement arm, a tool to eliminate threats and consolidate power. Anastasia had constructed this network with surgical precision, making him one of the most feared men in the world, not just within the mafia, but in the broader landscape of organized crime. But as the world of the mafia began to evolve, so did its tactics. Gambino, who would succeed Anastasia's leadership, represented a shift in the mafia's approach to power. Whereas Anastasia had ruled through sheer fear and violent dominance, Gambino sought to establish a more strategic and diplomatic control over his territory. Under Gambino's leadership, the mafia became less about ruthless showdowns and bloody battles for power, and more about subtly manipulating the political and financial systems to maintain their influence. Gambino's rise signified the changing nature of organized crime, moving from the brutal, overt methods of men like Anastasia to a more sophisticated, less conspicuous form of control. The shift from Anastasia's violent ways to Gambino's more calculated, patient approach wasn't just about tactics, it was about the evolution of the mafia itself. As the public's awareness of organized crime grew, so too did law enforcement's ability to infiltrate and dismantle criminal enterprises. The golden age of the mafia, which had once relied on fear and violence to secure its empire, was quickly giving way to a more covert form of corruption and manipulation. With law enforcement increasingly closing in, the mafia needed to adapt or risk being dismantled. It was no longer enough to rely on a network of hitmen and enforcers, the mafia had to learn how to infiltrate legitimate businesses, control unions, and exert influence through political power. Gambino understood this shift, and while Anastasia had been a product of a time that relied on brute force, Gambino saw the value of discretion, diplomacy, and quiet power. In some ways, however, Anastasia's influence didn't entirely fade. His legacy lived on through the very structures he had put in place. While Gambino and his peers moved away from the more overt, violent operations that had characterized Anastasia's reign, the fear and respect that had surrounded Anastasia remained a potent tool in the mafia's arsenal. Even in Gambino's more restrained leadership, the shadow of Anastasia's violence could still be felt. In the world of the mafia, power dynamics were never simply about who held the most wealth or territory, it was about who could inspire fear and command loyalty. Anastasia had mastered this art, and his ability to instill both admiration and terror in his men was something that could not easily be erased. As the mafia adapted to this new world, the remnants of Anastasia's era also continued to play a role in shaping the criminal landscape. Despite Gambino's more diplomatic approach, the mafia still operated with a sense of honor that was shaped by the men who had come before him, including Anastasia. The old ways, with their brutal codes of loyalty and their penchant for bloodshed, had not disappeared entirely. Rather, they had been transformed and incorporated into a new model of mafia operations. Gambino's leadership style might have been more refined, but the mafia still relied on the fundamental principles that had been laid down by figures like Anastasia, the importance of power, control, and influence, and the unspoken rule that betrayal would not be tolerated. While Gambino's rise marked a new direction for the mafia, Anastasia's brutal legacy would continue to influence the way future leaders approached crime. His reign had demonstrated the effectiveness of ruthless violence and uncompromising loyalty, lessons that were not easily forgotten. Even as the mafia sought to evolve and adapt to the changing world, the memory of Anastasia's violence remained a potent tool in the hands of those who sought to wield power. Fear and intimidation were still essential elements of the mafia's operations, even if they were now employed in more subtle ways. In the broader context of organized crime in America, the years following Anastasia's death marked a transition from an era dominated by overt violence to one where organized crime began to evolve into a more insidious form. The media, the public, and law enforcement had become more attuned to the mafia's activities, and the once unchecked criminal empires that ruled the streets of major cities were now being scrutinized. This change in public perception, combined with the increasing sophistication of law enforcement, meant that the mafia could no longer function as it once had. The days of operating in the shadows, with an unspoken rule of fear and violence, were coming to an end. Instead, the mafia had to find new ways to adapt and remain powerful without drawing the same attention it once had. For all the changes the mafia underwent in the years after Anastasia's death, his influence could still be felt. His creation of Murder Incorporated had left a legacy of terror, and his ruthlessness was seen as both a necessary evil and a cautionary tale. The criminal underworld knew that the mafia was evolving, but it also knew that it could never fully escape the lessons taught by men like Anastasia. His violent reign had shown the mafia what it was capable of, and in some ways, it had also shown what could happen when ambition and power were unchecked. Even as the mafia adapted to a new world, the legacy of Albert Anastasia remained an inescapable part of its history, a history that was written in blood and fear, and one that would continue to shape the future of organized crime for years to come. In many ways, the world that emerged after Anastasia's death was a more complex one. The mafia had become more entrenched in legitimate business, more adept at using political influence to protect its interests, and more reliant on subtlety and strategy. But the core of the mafia, its willingness to use violence when necessary, to eliminate rivals, and to protect its interests at all costs, remained unchanged. Albert Anastasia had played a pivotal role in shaping this world, and even though he was gone, his mark on the mafia would never truly fade. His story was not just about a man who rose to power through violence and bloodshed, it was a story of the fragility of power itself, of how even the most ruthless and feared leaders can be brought down in the blink of an eye. And in that way, the legacy of Albert Anastasia is not just about the man he was, but about the world he helped create, a world that continues to resonate through the underworld today. As the years passed after Albert Anastasia's brutal death, the criminal landscape continued to shift in ways that would eventually change the very nature of organized crime in America. His assassination, so shocking in public, was not just the end of an era, it was the catalyst for a broader transformation within the mafia. Though many of his contemporaries tried to distance themselves from the violent and chaotic reign that Anastasia had left behind, the lessons of his rise and fall were never far from the minds of those who came after him. The mafia, like all criminal organizations, was constantly evolving, but Anastasia's death made it clear that the world of organized crime was changing in ways that even the most powerful figures could not have predicted. One of the first major shifts in the mafia following Anastasia's death was the way in which the organization's leadership structure began to evolve. While Anastasia had relied heavily on a combination of fear, violence, and loyalty to maintain his grip on power, his successors recognized that these old methods were increasingly less effective in the new world of organized crime. The days of commanding an empire through sheer force were quickly fading, and those who sought to succeed Anastasia needed to adapt. The mafia, which had once been ruled by men like Anastasia, who would not hesitate to use violence to eliminate any perceived threat, now found itself looking for leaders who could build alliances and use more subtle forms of influence. Carlo Gambino, one of the most notable figures to rise after Anastasia's death, represented the shift in the mafia's approach to power. Unlike Anastasia, who had been driven by an almost primal urge to dominate through terror, Gambino's rise was more calculated, marked by a quiet, almost invisible leadership style. He understood that in order to survive in an increasingly scrutinized world, the mafia had to be less visible, more strategic, and less dependent on the overt violence that had once been its hallmark. Under Gambino's leadership, the mafia began to move away from the explosive, violent confrontations that had defined Anastasia's reign. Instead, Gambino focused on building relationships, consolidating power through political influence, and working behind the scenes to ensure that the mafia remained untouchable. Gambino's rise marked a critical moment in the history of the mafia. As law enforcement began to tighten its grip on organized crime, the mafia realized that it could no longer afford to rely solely on intimidation and brute force. The FBI, the press, and public awareness were all growing in strength, and the days when men like Anastasia could operate with impunity were numbered. Gambino, who had long been known for his quiet demeanor and thoughtful approach, was a perfect fit for this new era. He understood that the mafia's power no longer rested in the streets but in the boardrooms, political offices, and behind closed doors. Through careful negotiations and an acute understanding of the shifting power dynamics, Gambino ensured that the mafia would remain relevant, even as it had to adapt to a new set of rules. This change in leadership also meant a shift in the mafia's methods of operation. In the years following Anastasia's death, the mafia began to turn more and more to legitimate business practices to launder money and establish a front for its criminal enterprises. The focus moved away from the more overtly violent and illegal activities, such as extortion and racketeering, and toward financial operations that could provide the mafia with the same level of power and wealth, but with a lower risk of detection. The mafia's tentacles reached deeper into legitimate businesses, infiltrating everything from labor unions to construction companies, and even gaining influence over entire industries. The goal was no longer to create an empire based on fear and intimidation but to secure one based on wealth, influence, and control over legitimate markets. However, even as the mafia evolved into a more sophisticated and subtle operation, the remnants of Anastasia's reign continued to influence the culture and operations of the organization. The fear and respect that Anastasia had commanded were ingrained in the mafia's psyche. While leaders like Gambino worked to refine the organization's methods, there was always an underlying understanding that, when necessary, the mafia would revert to the old ways, the ways that had been pioneered by men like Anastasia. The capacity for violence, though hidden behind a veil of legitimacy and political influence, still remained a powerful tool in the mafia's arsenal. Even Gambino, who was often regarded as a more businesslike boss, understood the importance of maintaining that fearsome reputation. To be a leader of the mafia was not just about making money, it was about maintaining control, both through influence and intimidation. The increasing sophistication of the mafia did not, however, eliminate the possibility of violent struggles for power. While Gambino's rise was marked by a certain diplomacy and subtlety, the same could not be said for everyone in the mafia. As the organization expanded into new territories and sectors, internal rivalries and territorial disputes continued to fuel tensions. The mafia was a world in which loyalty was both revered and constantly tested, and the old guard, those who had built the empire through blood and brutality, were not always willing to let go of their traditional methods. As long as the mafia was built on a foundation of violence, even the most sophisticated members would have to reckon with the potential for violence to resurface when necessary. The murder of Albert Anastasia, while it signaled the end of his brutal reign, also underscored the constant flux within the mafia. Power was always in motion, and just as one leader fell, another would rise to take their place. Gambino's rise marked the beginning of a new chapter, but it also reminded the mafia that nothing was permanent. Even the most untouchable leaders were vulnerable, and the mafia, by its very nature, was a volatile, ever-changing entity. The fall of one giant was always the precursor to the rise of another, and the mafia had always been a game of survival, played with a ruthless sense of self-preservation. Yet, despite these internal struggles and power plays, the wider world of organized crime began to look very different in the years following Anastasia's death. The mafia was no longer the same monolithic entity it had once been. The landscape had changed, with the organization splintering into various factions and expanding into more legitimate channels. The violence and bloodshed that had once been so synonymous with the mafia were now part of a history that was being rewritten. The mafia was becoming a more complex, multifaceted organization, with an eye toward the future, a future in which subtlety and influence were the primary tools of power, rather than brute force and intimidation. For all the efforts to evolve, however, the core of the mafia remained unchanged. At its heart, the mafia was still a criminal organization, driven by the pursuit of power, money, and control. And in this world, loyalty was everything. While Gambino and his allies worked to navigate the shifting tides, they had to do so with one eye always watching their backs, aware that in the world of organized crime, betrayal could come from any direction. The mafia, for all its evolution, remained as dangerous and unpredictable as it had ever been. The death of Albert Anastasia marked the end of one chapter, but it also marked the beginning of another, one in which the mafia would adapt to survive, but never forget the lessons of the past. In the years to come, the legacy of Anastasia would continue to haunt the mafia, shaping its leaders, its methods, and its culture. Even as the mafia moved into new territories and engaged in new forms of criminal activity, the lessons of power, violence, and loyalty learned from men like Anastasia would continue to guide them. The fear that Anastasia had instilled in his enemies would never truly dissipate. It was a part of the mafia's DNA, and no amount of strategic adaptation would ever fully erase the need for power to be enforced with the same brutality that Anastasia had once exemplified. In the aftermath of Albert Anastasia's assassination, the shockwaves rippled far beyond the immediate chaos of the mafia's power struggle. His death signified the end of an era in which power was held through sheer terror and brutality, where the mafia's grip on the underworld was enforced through bloodshed. Anastasia had been one of the last of a generation of mobsters who wielded power with a mix of violence and raw authority, and his untimely end forced the mafia to confront its own fragility and its need to evolve in an increasingly dangerous world. However, while his violent reign had ended, the mafia's reliance on fear, loyalty, and control, principles that Anastasia had helped to shape, remained embedded in the very fabric of the organization. But what came next was a shift, a move toward subtlety, sophistication, and a quieter form of power. The landscape of organized crime was beginning to change, and those who followed Anastasia had to recognize that brute force was no longer the key to maintaining control. The growing influence of law enforcement, public awareness of organized crime's reach, and an increasingly sophisticated society made it clear that the old ways, where leadership was secured through violence and intimidation, were no longer sustainable. In the wake of Anastasia's death, the mafia had to adapt or risk falling into irrelevance. Gambino, who would eventually rise to power in the years following Anastasia's murder, represented a stark contrast to the world that Anastasia had known. While Anastasia had been a product of the violent streets of New York, ruled by personal vendettas, ruthlessness, and quick retribution, Gambino was a master of patience and quiet strategy. He understood that the mafia's future lay in its ability to evolve, to adapt to the changing landscape of crime, and to find new ways to remain powerful without attracting the same level of attention that had come with men like Anastasia. Gambino's careful and strategic rise to power marked the beginning of the mafia's shift from overt violence to more subtle, calculated methods of control. The approach Gambino took was one of quiet consolidation, not a loud declaration of power. He understood that the key to lasting influence lay not in the streets, but in the boardrooms, the back offices, and in the quiet manipulation of politics. While Anastasia had relied on Murder Incorporated, his deadly army of hitmen and enforcers, to maintain control, Gambino sought a different kind of power, one that was not so reliant on violence, but on influence, connections, and financial control. He understood that the days of openly orchestrating brutal killings in the streets, of terrorizing the population and his rivals alike, were coming to an end. Instead, Gambino's method was to work within the system, to control industries, manipulate unions, and extend his influence into legitimate businesses that allowed him to continue to reap the benefits of the criminal world without exposing himself to the same risks. Under Gambino's leadership, the mafia underwent a transformation. Instead of relying on public violence, the organization began to work behind the scenes, infiltrating businesses and influencing political systems in ways that allowed it to maintain its power without drawing attention to itself. It was a new era for the mafia, one that required subtlety and long-term planning, not the flash of violence that had characterized Anastasia's reign. This shift didn't erase the mafia's reliance on fear and violence, rather, it shifted those elements to the shadows. The capacity for violence was still very much a part of the mafia's operations, but it was now used with more discretion, only when necessary, and often in a way that ensured the mafia remained insulated from public scrutiny. However, this shift to a more controlled and subtle form of power did not mean that the mafia was free of challenges. The internal struggles that had plagued the organization during Anastasia's time continued, albeit in a different form. While Gambino's careful consolidation of power allowed him to rise without resorting to open violence, the underlying tension within the mafia was still palpable. The question of succession, of who would take control after Gambino, remained an ever-present concern. The power struggles that had characterized the mafia's history, struggles for control, revenge, and influence, continued to play out, albeit in less overt ways. But as the mafia adapted to the changing times, these struggles became more insidious, often hidden behind layers of legal operations and legitimate business dealings. As the mafia evolved into this more sophisticated and nuanced version of itself, the legacy of men like Albert Anastasia loomed large. His reign of terror had left a lasting imprint on the organization. Though the tactics had changed, the mafia's structure still owed much to the bloody, violent methods that Anastasia had employed. Even as Gambino and his allies moved the organization into more legitimate avenues, the fear and respect that had been associated with Anastasia's leadership remained ingrained in the mafia's psyche. For many of the younger mobsters who came into power after Anastasia's death, his name still carried weight. It was a symbol of the ruthlessness required to survive in the mafia, a reminder that while times might change, the core principles of the organization remained the same. Yet, the changes in the mafia did not simply stop at the level of leadership or tactics. The public's perception of organized crime was also undergoing a shift. As law enforcement agencies like the FBI became more aggressive in their efforts to dismantle organized crime, the mafia found itself on the defensive. The world that Anastasia had once dominated was changing, and the forces of law and order were now in a much stronger position to challenge the mafia's grip on power. The public's awareness of organized crime was at an all-time high, and with this awareness came a more concerted effort to root out the mafia and dismantle its operations. No longer could the mafia afford to operate in the open, no longer could it afford to openly challenge the law. The media played a significant role in this transformation. The press, with its growing interest in organized crime, helped to bring the mafia's operations to light in ways that had never been possible before. In many ways, the public's fascination with crime syndicates like the mafia helped fuel their downfall. What had once been a secretive world, operating in the shadows, was now out in the open for all to see. This visibility created vulnerabilities for the mafia, as law enforcement grew more adept at tracking and dismantling their operations. The days of operating freely, without the prying eyes of the public and the police, were quickly coming to an end. In response to these challenges, the mafia began to evolve its strategies once again. It became more insular, more hidden, and more reliant on its established network of influence and power. As the public learned more about the mafia's operations, the mafia worked harder to cloak itself in legitimacy. The mafia became more involved in legitimate businesses, more entrenched in politics, and more capable of concealing its criminal operations under layers of front organizations. The mafia's influence now spread outwards into new realms, unions, construction companies, and legitimate industries that allowed the mafia to continue its operations without attracting the same level of scrutiny. It was an attempt to adapt, to shift the battlefield from the streets to the boardrooms and political offices where power could be exercised with more subtlety. In the end, though, the lessons of Albert Anastasia's death were clear. Even in an era of greater subtlety and sophistication, the mafia could never fully escape the ghosts of its past. Anastasia's violent reign may have ended, but the mafia remained a force to be reckoned with, adapting to new challenges and finding new ways to survive. His legacy, marked by violence, fear, and the constant struggle for power, remained a core part of the mafia's identity. The mafia's transformation, from a violent and overtly powerful criminal organization to a more clandestine and sophisticated operation, was the natural result of a changing world. But no matter how much the mafia evolved, the ghosts of its past, of men like Anastasia, would always haunt its corridors. The lessons of power, loyalty, and violence would never be forgotten, and the mafia would continue to evolve, carrying with it the scars of its violent history. As the years passed following Albert Anastasia's death, the changing tides of the mafia reflected a delicate balance between old-world power and the emerging, more covert operations that would define the next chapter of organized crime. His violent reign, marked by intimidation and dominance, could no longer serve as a sustainable model in the evolving landscape. What emerged in its place was a shift, one that saw the mafia transitioning from a world of open violence to a world where subtlety, influence, and power behind closed doors began to take center stage. While the tactics and methods may have changed, the foundation of control and the deep-rooted codes of loyalty remained intact. Carlo Gambino's rise to power after Anastasia's assassination was a clear signal that the mafia was evolving. Where Anastasia had been a product of the violent streets, Gambino was a man of calm, a strategist who understood the changing environment and the need for the mafia to adapt to a more modern criminal enterprise. Gambino's leadership was not marked by the same brutal force that had characterized Anastasia's reign. Instead, it was marked by a quiet, almost invisible control that was exerted through influence, alliances, and a keen understanding of how to navigate the shifting currents of both legal and illegal economies. Gambino's careful and calculated consolidation of power was indicative of the direction in which the mafia was moving, away from the open bloodshed and reckless violence of the past and toward a more clandestine, business-oriented model. Under Gambino's leadership, the mafia began to refine its methods. While Anastasia had used violence as a tool to eliminate rivals and cement his control over the underworld, Gambino saw that a more subtle, less attention-grabbing approach would ensure the organization's survival. Rather than engaging in open confrontations, Gambino worked quietly behind the scenes, building relationships and alliances with key figures in both the criminal and legitimate worlds. He understood that the key to power in the future lay not just in controlling territory but in controlling industries, unions, and even legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for the mafia's illegal activities. In this way, the mafia became more integrated into the fabric of the broader economy, making it harder for law enforcement to track and dismantle its operations. One of the most significant changes under Gambino was the mafia's increased involvement in legitimate businesses. Where once the mafia had relied heavily on traditional rackets such as gambling, extortion, and bootlegging, Gambino recognized that the future of organized crime lay in the ability to infiltrate and control industries that appeared to be legitimate. By the time Gambino had solidified his power, the mafia was deeply embedded in everything from construction companies to waste management, from labor unions to trucking businesses. These industries allowed the mafia to generate revenue without drawing undue attention from law enforcement or the public. Moreover, They allowed the mafia to launder its illicit money, hiding it behind legitimate transactions that would pass under the radar of authorities. However, this shift did not mean that the mafia was abandoning its violent roots. While Gambino and his contemporaries preferred to avoid the open bloodshed that had defined the previous generation, they understood that violence would always be a part of the mafia's identity. It was not used as frequently as it had been under Anastasia's reign, but it was still a tool that could be wielded when necessary. The mafia had become more sophisticated, but it had not forgotten its brutal past. Gambino, for all his subtlety and strategic planning, was not above using violence to eliminate threats when the need arose. His ability to balance diplomacy and ruthlessness would prove to be one of his most important traits, allowing him to maintain his power and keep the mafia intact during an era of increasing law enforcement pressure. The public perception of organized crime was also changing during this time. The old-school mafia, with its flashy displays of power and open criminality, was increasingly being replaced by a quieter, more secretive version of organized crime. Law enforcement, particularly the FBI, was becoming more aggressive in its pursuit of mafia leaders, using new tactics and technologies to infiltrate the criminal underworld. The days when the mafia could operate in the shadows with little fear of interference were coming to an end. As the public's awareness of organized crime grew, the mafia had to adapt its strategies to stay one step ahead of the authorities. This meant moving further into legitimate businesses and political arenas, where the mafia could continue to exert influence without drawing attention to its criminal activities. But even as the mafia worked to stay out of the spotlight, its violent past continued to haunt it. The methods that had been employed by men like Anastasia were never truly forgotten. In the back rooms of mafia families, where power and loyalty were discussed, the legacy of Anastasia's reign was still revered. His ability to command fear and loyalty was seen as a standard to aspire to, even as the mafia sought to evolve into a more sophisticated organization. For some, Anastasia was not just a brutal leader but a symbol of what the mafia had once been: strong, unyielding, and above all, in control. The tension between the old guard and the new generation was palpable. The younger members of the mafia, many of whom had come of age in the more covert, business-driven world of Gambino, were often conflicted. On the one hand, they understood the need for discretion and the value of political influence. But on the other hand, they felt the pull of the past, of the violence and chaos that had made the mafia the most feared criminal organization in the world. This internal tension would continue to shape the mafia for decades to come, as each new generation sought to balance the lessons of the past with the realities of the present. Yet, even as the mafia began to shift toward more subtle forms of operation, it was clear that the organization's future was uncertain. The forces that had once kept the mafia at the top of the criminal world, its ability to control territories through violence, fear, and intimidation, were no longer as effective in the modern world. Law enforcement had grown more adept at targeting organized crime, and public scrutiny was at an all-time high. The mafia could no longer afford to operate with the same level of overt power that it had in the past. The organization had to evolve or risk being destroyed by its own excesses. Despite these challenges, the mafia's ability to adapt to the changing world of crime allowed it to survive longer than many thought possible. The old-school mobsters, with their ties to violence and corruption, gave way to a new generation of leaders who understood the importance of discretion and subtlety. The mafia's involvement in legitimate business, while a necessary adaptation, would ultimately ensure its survival in a world where open violence was no longer tolerated. And even though the mafia's methods had changed, its culture of loyalty, fear, and control remained the same. The death of Albert Anastasia, a man whose reign had been defined by brutality and violence, ultimately served as a turning point for the mafia. His assassination marked the end of an era, but it also paved the way for a more sophisticated, less visible form of organized crime. As the mafia adapted to a changing world, it would rely less on the overt tactics that had defined men like Anastasia and more on the power of influence, politics, and legitimate business. The legacy of Anastasia, however, would never be forgotten. His methods, while not as prominently employed, would continue to inform the way the mafia operated for years to come. His story was one of violence, power, and ultimately, change. But as the mafia continued to evolve, it was clear that the lessons of Anastasia's rise and fall would remain a part of its identity, shaping the criminal world for generations to come. Albert Anastasia's assassination was not merely a violent chapter in the history of organized crime, it was a profound moment that reverberated across the entire mafia world. His death in 1957 marked the end of an era where power was gained and maintained through sheer force, intimidation, and an unrelenting hold over the criminal underworld. While the immediate aftermath of Anastasia's death saw a power vacuum and uncertainty within his faction, it also represented a pivot for the mafia, a moment when it could either adapt to a changing landscape or risk fading into obscurity. Though Anastasia's reign had been marked by brutality and unchecked violence, his absence created space for a new kind of leadership to emerge, one that would redefine the mafia's very essence. For those who followed, the legacy of Anastasia was one of dominance through fear. His leadership had been absolute, his control over Murder Incorporated, and his strategic eliminations of rivals had left an indelible mark. However, as the world began to shift, both socially and politically, the mafia had to consider that violence was no longer the most effective means of maintaining control. The age of openly murdering one's way to the top was fading, and new methods of exerting power, influence, and control were coming into focus. The advent of sophisticated law enforcement techniques, political scrutiny, and a growing media presence meant that staying in the shadows was no longer enough. The mafia had to find ways to integrate themselves into legitimate business and operate in a more covert, strategic fashion. This shift in approach began with Carlo Gambino, the man who would ultimately take control of the Gambino crime family and usher in a new era of mafia leadership. Gambino's rise was not marked by the public bloodshed and territorial dominance that had characterized Anastasia's reign. Instead, Gambino was a careful operator, one who understood the importance of building alliances, securing influence, and navigating the increasingly complex landscape of American politics and business. He recognized that to survive in the modern world of organized crime, the mafia had to evolve. Gambino's vision for the future of the mafia was clear: it needed to be a more covert operation, blending in with the business world and using its influence behind the scenes rather than on the streets. Under Gambino's leadership, the mafia shifted from its reliance on violent acts of extortion, bootlegging, and overt criminality, to a more nuanced form of operation. No longer was it enough to control the streets through fear. Now, the mafia had to infiltrate industries, manipulate labor unions, and exercise control over legitimate businesses. The old rackets, which had once been the cornerstone of mafia operations, were being overshadowed by the growing importance of corporate influence, political ties, and financial control. Gambino and his successors began using their influence to run companies, secure union positions, and find ways to hide their illicit profits behind legitimate operations. This shift did not mean the mafia was abandoning its violent roots, it simply meant that violence would be used more sparingly and only when absolutely necessary. The mafia had learned that the key to power in the future was discretion. Yet, despite this newfound sophistication, there were still many who viewed the mafia's success through the lens of violence and intimidation. Men like Anastasia had shown that the mafia's foundation rested on fear. And while Gambino's reign marked a more diplomatic approach, the shadow of Anastasia's violent past could never truly be escaped. The threat of force, though hidden behind a curtain of legitimate business dealings and political maneuvering, remained an underlying aspect of the mafia's operations. The mafia could no longer operate as it had under Anastasia's reign, but it still relied on many of the same principles: loyalty, respect, and, when necessary, fear. The 1960s and 1970s marked a period of increased government scrutiny and public awareness of organized crime. With the rise of the FBI and federal prosecutions, the mafia found itself under unprecedented pressure. The tactics that had once allowed it to operate with relative impunity, brutal enforcement, terror, and overwhelming force, began to falter under the weight of legal scrutiny and public outcry. The public's perception of the mafia had shifted from that of a shadowy, almost romanticized organization to one of an unchecked menace that needed to be eradicated. Law enforcement agencies were beginning to find success in their efforts to infiltrate the mafia and dismantle its operations. For the mafia, this presented a new challenge. Gambino, like other mafia leaders of his time, had to contend with the growing power of law enforcement and the public's demand for justice. However, instead of resorting to the violent tactics of his predecessors, Gambino understood that the key to survival lay in using political influence and control over legitimate businesses. As law enforcement ramped up its efforts to expose and shut down mafia operations, Gambino's strategy was to remain as invisible as possible. His family, along with other powerful factions of the mafia, turned increasingly to the business world as a means of sustaining their power. One of the most significant ways in which the mafia transformed during this period was through its involvement in the construction industry. The mafia had long been involved in labor racketeering, using its control over unions to extort money from legitimate businesses. But under Gambino's leadership, the mafia expanded its influence into the building industry, controlling the flow of contracts and making billions of dollars in the process. This was not the violent, blood-soaked world that Anastasia had known. It was a world of boardrooms and backroom deals, where the mafia could manipulate the flow of money without drawing attention to its illegal activities. Construction projects, which were critical to the development of America's cities and infrastructure, became one of the primary sources of income for the mafia. By infiltrating the unions and controlling the flow of labor, the mafia had a stranglehold on the construction industry, which allowed them to continue profiting while avoiding the scrutiny that had plagued them in the past. The mafia's increasing involvement in legitimate business ventures was not the only adaptation that took place during this time. As law enforcement became more effective at targeting traditional mafia operations, the mafia had to rely on more sophisticated techniques to avoid detection. The rise of technology, such as wiretaps, surveillance, and sophisticated investigative methods, made it more difficult for the mafia to maintain the secrecy it once had. In response, the mafia began to develop new methods of communicating, organizing, and carrying out its activities. Mobsters began using encrypted devices and secure communication channels to stay ahead of law enforcement's increasingly sophisticated tactics. Despite these efforts to stay ahead of the law, the mafia was not immune to the shifting dynamics of society. As the decades passed, the criminal underworld became increasingly fragmented. The mafia, once an imposing monolith of organized crime, found itself battling not only law enforcement but also rival factions within its own ranks. Power struggles between different families, disputes over territory, and disagreements over business practices created internal fractures that weakened the organization from within. Gambino's careful consolidation of power was eventually challenged by other factions within the mafia, leading to a new set of rivalries and power struggles that threatened the stability of the organization. These internal conflicts, combined with the growing external pressures from law enforcement and the public, led to a period of instability for the mafia. The days of absolute control were slipping away, replaced by an environment of constant tension and uncertainty. The mafia was no longer the undisputed ruler of organized crime, it had to contend with new players, new tactics, and new challenges that made survival much more difficult. The old world of brutal dominance and fear had been replaced by a more complex, more insidious version of organized crime, one in which power was maintained through influence, money, and control of legitimate business, rather than by wielding a knife or a gun. In many ways, the mafia's transformation from the era of Anastasia to the world of Gambino and beyond reflected the broader changes in American society. The world of the 1950s and 1960s was one of rapid economic growth, political change, and increasing technological advancements. The mafia, which had once thrived in the shadows, was now forced to adapt to a world where transparency and scrutiny were becoming the norm. As the mafia adjusted its tactics and its business dealings, it found new ways to survive and even thrive in this new reality. But despite these adaptations, the core principles that had defined the mafia, loyalty, fear, power, and money, remained unchanged. The death of Albert Anastasia marked the end of a brutal and violent era, but it also paved the way for a new form of mafia leadership. The organization, though weakened in some ways, had learned valuable lessons from its past. The mafia's ability to evolve, to adapt to a changing world, ensured its survival for years to come. But no matter how much the organization changed, the shadow of men like Anastasia would never truly disappear. His legacy, marked by ruthlessness, fear, and dominance, remained woven into the fabric of the mafia's identity, and it would continue to shape its operations long after he was gone. As the mafia continued its evolution throughout the mid-20th century, the transition from the era of violence and fear to one of subtlety and corporate maneuvering was not without its challenges. The underworld was no longer just about power gained through intimidation on the streets. Now, the mafia was learning to operate within the increasingly scrutinized corridors of politics, business, and finance. Yet, despite these shifts, the deep-seated traditions of loyalty, violence, and power that had been hallmarks of men like Albert Anastasia were never far from the surface. The lessons learned from the bloodshed and brutal control of the previous era still shaped the actions of the mafia's new leaders. The underlying question of how to maintain power, control, and influence, without the direct violence that once characterized the mafia's hold on New York, remained a constant preoccupation. Carlo Gambino, who rose to lead the Gambino family after Anastasia's murder, represented this delicate balance between change and tradition. Although his reign would be marked by a quieter, more business-oriented approach to mafia leadership, the remnants of Anastasia's violent legacy were evident in Gambino's methods. Gambino understood the necessity of power, but he also recognized that in the modern world, that power had to be more discreet. The stakes were too high, and the scrutiny too intense, for the mafia to continue to operate as openly as it had under Anastasia's reign. Gambino and his contemporaries were operating in an environment where law enforcement was catching up to their methods, where media exposure was growing, and where even the public's perception of the mafia was evolving. In this new landscape, the mafia began to see itself as part of a larger ecosystem, no longer an isolated, violent subculture but an entity embedded in legitimate business and the political system. The days of the mafia leader as a feared tyrant, like Anastasia, were fading. Instead, the mafia under Gambino's leadership found success by working behind the scenes, forming alliances, making calculated business moves, and even participating in the political process. The mafia's key to survival no longer lay in dominating through fear alone. Now, influence and wealth, built through investments in legitimate industries, became the new currency for power. Gambino was able to shift the narrative around the mafia, turning it from a criminal organization feared for its brutality to one that, while still engaging in illicit activities, was seen as a legitimate player in various sectors of American society. The focus on legitimate business ventures, such as construction, trucking, and waste management, was a direct result of this shift. Where men like Anastasia had relied on extortion, murders, and street-level rackets to maintain their position, Gambino saw that the key to long-term survival lay in creating a facade of legitimacy. The mafia's foray into the construction business was particularly significant, as it allowed them to launder money and gain enormous power by controlling labor unions. By infiltrating unions and manipulating contracts, the mafia could control the flow of money on major building projects, essentially holding the city's development process hostage. This new form of power was subtler, more hidden from public view, but it allowed the mafia to continue to prosper while flying under the radar of law enforcement and public scrutiny. However, this new approach came with its own set of challenges. The more the mafia integrated into legitimate business, the more it had to guard against exposure. Gambino's strategy was clear: keep a low profile, avoid unnecessary violence, and focus on the financial side of operations. But even as the mafia became more sophisticated, the underlying danger remained. While the public face of the organization may have shifted, the mafia was still a criminal enterprise at its core, and its leaders were always at risk of being taken down by law enforcement or internal rivals. The increasing pressure from law enforcement during the 1960s and 1970s brought new challenges to the mafia. With the FBI intensifying its efforts to infiltrate organized crime, the mafia had to find new ways to protect its operations. The technological advances that made it easier for the government to monitor and investigate mafia activities also made it more difficult for the organization to operate in the shadows as it once had. The mafia's response to this threat was to become more secretive, relying on coded communications, encrypted messages, and a more compartmentalized organizational structure. Gone were the days when the mafia's operations were run in the open, with mobsters conducting business in public places like bars and restaurants. Now, the mafia operated with a level of secrecy and sophistication that matched the growing intelligence and capabilities of law enforcement. This evolution in tactics mirrored the broader social changes occurring at the time. The 1960s and 1970s were a time of societal upheaval, where the traditional power structures of America were being questioned, and new movements for civil rights, social justice, and political transparency were emerging. At the same time, the government's war on organized crime became a significant focus, as the public grew more aware of the mafia's stranglehold on certain industries and the corruption that seeped into politics. The mafia, once viewed as a shadowy but glamorous underworld, was now being cast in a much darker light. Law enforcement had finally begun to make significant inroads into dismantling the most powerful families in the country, and the mafia was forced to adapt if it was to survive. Under Gambino's leadership, the mafia adapted by shifting its focus toward more clandestine operations, but the violence and power dynamics that had been an inherent part of the mafia's existence were not easily cast aside. Though Gambino himself was not known for his brutality, his rule was still marked by the underlying threat of force. The mafia may have transitioned from street-level violence to more business-minded ventures, but the mafia bosses still operated on a strict code of loyalty and fear. In this new era, the mafia's power was no longer based on physical dominance but rather on economic leverage, the control of unions, and the ability to make deals with both criminal and legitimate entities. Yet, the mafia's continued reliance on loyalty and fear ensured that its violent past could never be entirely erased. As the mafia continued to adapt to these changes, it also began to face new challenges from within. The introduction of more business-minded approaches did not sit well with everyone. There were still mobsters who viewed the mafia as a brotherhood built on the old ways, with blood and loyalty binding the ranks. The younger generation of mafiosos, raised in a time of political intrigue and corporate growth, did not always see the value in the traditional mafia code that had governed their predecessors' actions. This generational divide created tensions within the ranks, and as more power players like Gambino moved the mafia toward economic dominance, some felt that the organization was losing its soul, its very identity. One of the most notable aspects of this period was how the mafia's image began to shift in the eyes of the public. While figures like Anastasia had been feared, even admired for their ruthless grip on power, Gambino's quieter, more strategic leadership earned him a different kind of reputation. He was seen as a man who knew how to play the game of business and politics just as well as the game of crime. But this shift in perception also highlighted an uncomfortable truth: the mafia was no longer just a criminal organization, it was now part of a larger network of corruption that spanned both the legal and illegal worlds. The public's understanding of the mafia began to change from a criminal enterprise to a sprawling, multifaceted system that was woven into the fabric of American society. This new understanding of the mafia's role in American life was both a strength and a weakness. On the one hand, it allowed the mafia to thrive in a world that had become increasingly hostile to overt violence. On the other hand, it brought the mafia closer to the attention of the government and the public. Law enforcement, now more sophisticated and aggressive than ever, began to understand the mafia's business methods and its network of influence. As a result, they were able to target and dismantle parts of the organization more effectively than ever before. Even as Gambino worked to shield the organization from legal scrutiny, it became clear that the mafia could not continue on its path without facing serious consequences. The organization had grown large and unwieldy, and the more it attempted to blend in with the legitimate world, the more it risked drawing attention to itself. In many ways, the mafia had become a victim of its own success. The very systems it had infiltrated, the businesses it had taken over, and the political figures it had corrupted were now under the microscope. The deeper the mafia dug into the legitimate world, the more likely it was to be exposed. In the years that followed, the mafia would continue to evolve, but the legacy of Albert Anastasia's era of violence and brute force would never be fully erased. His legacy was embedded in the very DNA of the mafia. Even as Gambino and his successors worked to distance themselves from the blood-soaked past, the organization remained built on the principles of loyalty, fear, and control. The changing face of the mafia, from the days of Anastasia to the more corporate, business-minded approach under Gambino, was merely a reflection of the world around it, one that was increasingly complex, interconnected, and scrutinized by a public that was no longer willing to look the other way. As the 1970s unfolded, the mafia found itself in an increasingly precarious position. The world around it was rapidly changing, and with it, the methods and strategies that had once ensured the organization's dominance in American crime. The violent, overt tactics that had characterized the reign of figures like Albert Anastasia were no longer viable in the modern world. Law enforcement had grown more sophisticated, employing new technologies and more aggressive tactics in their fight against organized crime. The mafia's ability to operate with impunity was fading fast, and it was clear that the old ways of doing business were becoming obsolete. The days of openly running rackets on the streets, and of making power moves through public displays of brutality, were quickly coming to an end. In its place, a new breed of mafia bosses had to emerge, men who could maintain control not through violence, but through influence, intelligence, and subtlety. The transition from the old guard of mobsters to a more covert, business-minded mafia was not without tension. For many, the mafia was still deeply rooted in the old traditions, loyalty, fear, and violence. The younger generation, while more attuned to the shifting landscape of organized crime, still found it difficult to fully abandon the brutal methods that had ensured their success for so many years. Yet, the pressures of the modern world demanded a new kind of leadership, one that could navigate the increasingly complex and interconnected world of legitimate business, political corruption, and media scrutiny. And this was precisely where figures like Paul Castellano and John Gotti emerged. Castellano, who took control of the Gambino family after Gambino's death, represented the more business-oriented, corporate approach to mafia leadership. He recognized that the days of the mob's dominance through street-level violence were over, and that the mafia had to find new ways to exert influence. Castellano was not a violent man by nature. Instead, he preferred to run his operations from behind the scenes, using his business acumen to secure lucrative deals and partnerships in legitimate industries. His focus was on construction, real estate, and other ventures that could provide a steady stream of income without drawing attention. Castellano's approach was one that sought to blend the mafia into the fabric of society, hiding its criminal operations behind the veil of legitimate businesses. However, Castellano's leadership was not without its challenges. His business-like approach to mafia leadership created a rift between him and other more traditional members of the Gambino family. Many of the older mobsters, who had risen to power through years of violence and street-level rackets, saw Castellano's method of doing business as weak and untraditional. The old guard, led by figures like John Gotti, who had built their reputations through acts of violence and intimidation, saw Castellano as an outsider, someone who was trying to take the mafia away from its roots. This tension boiled over when Castellano attempted to tighten his control over the family's operations, pushing out those who were resistant to his vision. At the heart of the conflict was the mafia's very identity. The younger generation, embodied by Gotti, believed in maintaining the traditions of the past, those of loyalty, fear, and the use of violence to maintain control. They viewed Castellano's attempt to transform the organization into a more legitimate enterprise as a betrayal of what the mafia was supposed to stand for. To them, the mafia was more than just a criminal business, it was a brotherhood, bound by a code of silence, loyalty, and respect. And when that code was violated, as they saw it in Castellano's business-first approach, it threatened the very soul of the organization. The conflict between Castellano and Gotti was not merely a personal dispute, it represented a larger struggle within the mafia itself, a struggle between the old ways and the new ways, between tradition and adaptation, between fear and influence. The mafia was at a crossroads, and the decisions made by its leaders during this time would shape its future for decades to come. The rise of Gotti marked the end of an era and the beginning of another, one where the mafia would attempt to balance the lessons of the past with the realities of the modern world. John Gotti's rise to power was a direct challenge to Castellano's vision for the future of the Gambino family. Gotti, who had made a name for himself through his involvement in the family's more traditional operations, rejected Castellano's attempts to move the organization into a more business-oriented, politically connected entity. For Gotti and his allies, the mafia was never just a business, it was a lifestyle, a code of conduct that demanded loyalty, respect, and, above all, the willingness to do whatever was necessary to maintain power. Gotti's belief in the mafia's violent traditions made him the natural heir to the old guard, even as the world around him was changing. Gotti's meteoric rise came at a time when the mafia was under intense scrutiny from law enforcement. The government had launched a full-scale assault on organized crime, using wiretaps, informants, and even the newly established RICO, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, statute to target mafia families. Gotti's leadership was defined by his ability to navigate this new world of law enforcement pressure. His skill at evading conviction in the face of mounting evidence earned him the nickname, the Teflon Don. Gotti's ability to beat the system, to emerge unscathed from multiple trials, further solidified his place at the top of the Gambino family. His rise to power was not just a personal victory, it was a victory for the mafia's traditional values, which had long been built on the idea that loyalty and fear were the cornerstones of control. Yet, Gotti's leadership also marked the beginning of the end for the mafia's dominance in America. The more Gotti relied on violence and intimidation, the more the government took notice. His brazen behavior, his willingness to flaunt his power, and his open defiance of law enforcement only brought more heat to the family. And while Gotti's leadership was able to reinvigorate the mafia's traditional values, it also highlighted the organization's inability to adapt to the changing dynamics of the world around it. As the 1980s progressed, the mafia's grip on the underworld began to weaken. Law enforcement, particularly the FBI, had become much more adept at infiltrating the mafia and gathering intelligence. The use of wiretaps, surveillance, and even informants became a common tool for law enforcement, allowing them to gain unprecedented access to the mafia's operations. The days of operating in secrecy, of making deals behind closed doors and avoiding the law through sheer force, were rapidly coming to an end. The government's increasing ability to dismantle the mafia's operations meant that the organization had to become more secretive, more sophisticated, and more careful about how it conducted its business. But even as the mafia attempted to adapt to these new realities, it was clear that the old ways were no longer sustainable. The violent, chaotic world that had defined figures like Albert Anastasia had given way to a more complex, politically charged environment in which the mafia had to operate with a far greater level of caution. The rise of John Gotti and his subsequent downfall illustrated the inherent tension within the mafia, a tension between its violent roots and its need to evolve in order to survive. The murder of Paul Castellano in 1985 was the symbolic death of the old guard, but it was also the death knell for the idea of the mafia as a purely violent organization. Gotti's decision to have Castellano killed was an assertion of control, a rejection of the business-first approach that Castellano had championed. But in doing so, Gotti ensured that the mafia would never again be able to return to its former glory. His reign, though marked by his ability to evade conviction and his unapologetic embrace of violence, also signaled the beginning of the end for the mafia's reign of terror in America. The public's perception of the mafia had changed, and law enforcement had become increasingly capable of taking down powerful figures like Gotti. In the end, the story of the mafia during this period is one of transition and conflict, a conflict between the old ways and the new, between violence and subtlety, between tradition and adaptation. The mafia's dominance was never fully eradicated, but its power began to fade, as the organization's ability to adapt to a rapidly changing world was increasingly put to the test. As law enforcement grew more sophisticated and public awareness of the mafia's operations grew, the once feared criminal organization found itself facing an uncertain future. And yet, through all the shifts in leadership and changes in strategy, the mafia's core principles of loyalty, fear, and control remained unchanged, a testament to the legacy of men like Albert Anastasia, whose violent reign had shaped the criminal underworld for decades. The early 1990s saw a dramatic decline in the traditional power of the mafia, but its grip on certain aspects of the criminal world still held strong. While law enforcement had made significant strides in dismantling the mafia through the use of informants, wiretaps, and intricate investigations, the criminal underworld had not yet been fully eradicated. The mafia's influence, though no longer as visible as it had been in the past, continued to linger, especially in the areas of labor unions, construction, and other businesses that had been heavily infiltrated by organized crime. The fall of many of the once great mafia families, however, marked a significant turning point for the organization, one where it became increasingly clear that the mafia's hold on power had been irreversibly weakened. The key to the mafia's survival in the early 1990s lay not in its ability to conduct large-scale operations or exert control through fear and violence, but in its ability to adapt, albeit slowly, to the changing criminal landscape. What had once been a world dominated by men like Albert Anastasia, whose very name struck terror into the hearts of anyone who crossed him, was now filled with figures who were less public, more cautious, and more embedded within the legitimate business world. The mafia's continued operations were largely based on corruption, secrecy, and maintaining its influence in key sectors of the economy, such as construction and waste management. Though the mafia's once feared reputation had diminished, its ability to silently shape economic transactions and influence decisions from the shadows was still a powerful tool. These silent, behind-the-scenes operations became the lifeblood of the mafia's continued existence, but they were also the reason why the organization's once glorious reign was quickly coming to an end. The shift in how the mafia operated had a profound impact on its structure. The older, more traditional figures like John Gotti, who had maintained the mafia's violent code and relied heavily on overt intimidation, found themselves increasingly isolated from the new generation of organized crime figures. With the rise of more sophisticated crime organizations, including drug cartels and international syndicates, the mafia was no longer the dominant force in the criminal underworld. The old mafia families, which had once controlled vast swaths of territory and operated with near impunity, found themselves competing with newer, more globalized networks of crime. While men like Gotti had made headlines and remained visible figures in the press, the world was changing around them, and the mafia, in its traditional form, was struggling to maintain its foothold. John Gotti's downfall was symbolic of the broader struggles the mafia faced during this period. His rise to power had been built on a foundation of violence and manipulation, and his reign had been marked by his ability to evade conviction time and time again. But as law enforcement grew more adept and used new technologies to track mafia operations, Gotti's luck began to run out. His infamous trial and conviction in 1992 sent shockwaves through the mafia, solidifying his place in history as the last of the great mafia bosses in New York. The Teflon Don, who had once been nearly untouchable, was finally brought to justice, serving as a stark reminder of the changing realities the mafia had to contend with. It was an end to an era, and though Gotti's charisma and notoriety had made him a larger-than-life figure, the conviction marked a critical turning point in the decline of mafia power. By the time Gotti was sent to prison, many of the families in the mafia were already facing internal divisions and struggles for control. Gotti's trial had revealed much about the internal workings of the Gambino family and the power struggles that had plagued the organization for years. As the mafia's old guard began to fade away, younger, more ambitious figures sought to carve out their own empires. But these new leaders faced immense challenges, as the tactics that had once guaranteed success, violence, intimidation, and ruthless control, were no longer as effective in an era where law enforcement was more powerful, and where public scrutiny of organized crime was at an all-time high. The old methods of power were being replaced by a new set of rules, one that demanded discretion, patience, and a far more careful approach to criminal activity. The mafia's continued involvement in the world of construction, trucking, and waste management in the 1990s was one of the few areas where it still maintained some semblance of control. These industries had long been key to the mafia's ability to launder money and maintain its power, and they remained crucial to the organization's survival. By controlling key labor unions and using them to extort money from businesses, the mafia was able to continue its operations under the radar. However, these businesses were also increasingly under the watchful eyes of the government, and the mafia was forced to operate with far more caution than it had in previous decades. Gone were the days when mafia bosses could openly demand protection money or engage in violent turf wars to secure their territory. Now, the mafia had to rely on more subtle means of control, using legal methods to protect their interests while remaining largely invisible to the public. As the 1990s progressed, the mafia's influence continued to wane. The government's crackdown on organized crime became more aggressive, with a particular focus on the mafia's infiltration of legitimate industries. The FBI, in particular, began using more sophisticated methods to take down mafia figures, including the use of wiretaps, informants, and undercover agents. The mafia's reliance on secrecy and violence made it vulnerable to these new tactics, and law enforcement was able to penetrate the organization in ways that had once been unimaginable. The mafia, once able to thrive in the shadows, found itself increasingly exposed to the light of public scrutiny and government investigation. Despite these mounting challenges, the mafia's core beliefs remained intact. Loyalty, respect, and the code of silence that had defined the organization for decades were still upheld by many of the mafia's remaining members. Even as the power of the mafia diminished, its culture of loyalty and fear continued to define its operations. Those who remained in the mafia adhered to the old rules, even as the world around them changed. But this culture, while once the mafia's strength, had become its greatest liability. The code of silence that had allowed the organization to operate with impunity in the past now made it more difficult for law enforcement to gather information and build cases. The mafia's reliance on secrecy, while once an asset, had become a hindrance to its survival in the modern world.